Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 49 of Vassals of Kingsgrave's epic linear Song of Ice and Fire reread. My name's Bina007 and I'll be your host today, and we will be covering the events from December 8th to December 14th, 299, so very shortly before the Red Wedding. Those chapters are Jon 5, Bran 3 and Cat 6 from A Storm of Swords. We will be spoiling potentially anything from the Song of Ice and Fire series, potentially preview chapters, but not intentionally from Game of Thrones, the TV show. Joining me today are a bunch of ladies and another lady. The bunch of ladies are those that met up with me recently in Los Angeles for the epic La La Land moot, and also Mikhail from the other side of America. So
please rub it in more.
I know. So, Mikhail, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Hi, I'm Mikhail. I'm ink as rain.
Also present, present at La La Land moot was Hannah.
Hey, it's Shadow Baby on the forums.
Sarah.
Hey, it's Dr. Blood on the forums.
And joining us for the first time on the podcast, and it seems like forever, Amber Rocks.
Yo, 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 it's the podcast worker. What up, what up, what up? Hey, this is Amber Rocks on the forums.
When was the last time you were actually on a podcast, not lurking, just properly podcasting, Amber?
I don't remember.
Yeah.
Long time.
I think I speak for the people of VOC when we say we're very happy to have you back, and long may it continue.
Yay! Hooray Monday podcasting. So,
fantastic. I know. I will try and make some stuff happen in future that's not just all on weekends. Okay, so with that, let's get into the chapters. At the end of the last episode of the reread, we left Giddy giving birth at Craster's Keep on the 4th of December 299, and that was in Sam 2. Sansa had just turned 13, sweet summer child that she is. We begin this episode with Jon 5 on December 8th. This is 8 chapters and 100 pages later in my edition of the published order. So a big jump, and I think it's Mikhail with the summary.
It is indeed. This chapter could be subtitled Wildling Chicks, am I right? So basically, Jon and the Wildlings travel south through the abandoned Brandon's Gift, where Ygritte is awed by the technical marvels of watchtowers. Jon desperately wants to take Ygritte back to Winterfell so they can have sex in front of the old gods. I don't know why he wants to do that, but he does. He knows that can never be, however. The couple argue about the culture of wildlings in Westeros, and Jon is struck again by how much of a wildling his wildling girlfriend is. Ygritte says something interesting when she points out, when they're arguing about kind of possessions and stuff like that, she says, the gods made the earth for all men to share. Only when the kings came with their crowns and steel swords, they claimed it was all theirs. My trees, they said, you can't eat them apples. My stream, you can't fish here. My wood, you're not to hunt. Etc., etc. You call us thieves, but at least a thief has to be brave and clever and quick. A kneeler only has to kneel. Ygritte is very much in line with the Darwinist wildling philosophy that girls deserve to be kidnapped by strong men, and that if the women are strong enough, then they won't let men hurt them. So, it's your fault if your husband is awful. She says that if she were married to a bad man, she'd cut his throat while he slept. You know nothing, Jon Snow. They also argue about the wildling chances against the organized forces of Westeros. However, in spite of all this bickering, Ygritte insists that Jon is no crow. I swore you weren't, so you'd better not be, she tells him. You're mine as I'm yours, and if we die, we die. All men must die, Jon Snow, but first we'll live. Jon is really into this form of philosophy that she's espousing. He's like literally a college student reading Nietzsche for the first time. Jon continues to be haunted by the half-hand's instructions as he is questioned for information by the Magnar, and he grows closer with the wildlings around him against his will. The Watch, he knows, is basically fucked if the wildlings attack, and he is desperate to find a way back to warn them. He wonders, rather foolishly, if Ygritte will definitely kill him if he tries to escape. A wild storm descends as night falls, and the group takes shelter in a collapsed village near a tower set on a small island. The wildlings follow a small fire and find an old man and his horse in the ruins of an inn. Jon knows the man is doomed, so he sulks off to look at the tower, from which Ygritte says some Thens have heard shouting. She assumes it's ghosts. John wants to investigate, but contents himself with pointing out the gold-painted merlins on the tower, because this, after all, is Queen's Crown, where old King Jaehaerys' wife, the good Queen Alysanne, spent the night on her way to see the wall. Ygritte opines that good Queen Alysanne would have been a better queen if she had torn down the wall instead, and John's like, yeah, that's dumb. The pensive reprieve is interrupted by the Thenns calling John back to the inn. Styr the Magnar orders John to kill the old man. John is loath to do this, but draws Longclaw, which feels heavy in his hand. You must not balk whatever is asked of you. Ride with them, eat with them, fight with them, he remembers. But this old man had offered no resistance. He had been unlucky, that was all. Ygritte urges him to kill the man, to prove you are no crow, but one of the free folk. She reminds him also that he's being kind of hypocritical when he's like, oh, well, the guy's just like here. And Ygritte's like, well, I was just on the mountain and I was asleep and you were about to kill me, so, However, John still refuses to kill the man. I say, yes, I command here, Styr the Magnar says. You command Thenns, John told him, not free folk. I see no free folk, Styr says. I see a crow and a crow wife. At this insult, Ygritte goes wild and slits the old man's throat. You know nothing, Jon Snow, she shouts at him. Styr gives an order, but with a crash of lightning, a grey wolf comes tearing through the wildling pack. With a sword in his hand, which suddenly feels light, Jon makes his choice, cutting through the wildlings that he has come to know, leaping onto the mare and riding away. 3 hours later, the rain dies down, and Jon stops to remove the arrow in his thigh. He washes it, but is still not sure if it's Ygritte's arrow or someone else's. He rests a while and then continues on to Castle Black. Apropos of absolutely nothing, Jon finds his way to Castle Black by seeking out the Ice Dragon constellation in the sky. He rode until dawn, Martin writes, while the stars stared down like eyes. And that's the chapter.
Is it because this chapter starts a little earlier that you put it in front of the Bran chapter?
It's a good question. I mean, obviously, it's not my order. It's the Magic Redditor.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I don't know why I think it's you.
No, I don't know. Sometimes I think it's because of where they start and finish, maybe. But yeah, because they're basically concurrent, aren't they? So you could almost basically just have them in either order, I guess.
It's Bran and then it's Jon in the book, and I couldn't really figure out, does it really make a difference reading one before the other?
I think it's more the tension of men showing up and then you don't know who they are or if they've been heard in the tower.
Yeah, I think Bran first makes a little bit more sense just because they get there first and then they find the causeway. I don't know. Yeah, I was surprised that we had switched it.
Fucking Reddit.
It's got to be because it starts a little sooner.
Exactly. There'll be some internal logic that makes utter sense. If on the small, minuscule, infinitesimal chance that the Redditor is listening, please don't take offense of that. We love you. You made this possible.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make that sound rude.
No, but it's a valid point, right? When you start chopping and changing the order, it's a totally valid point.
This is something that's really bothered me for a long time about the wildlings. But this whole idea of stealing a woman and having, or a girl, and this being a ritual of courtship that is not pro forma necessarily. It's not just okay, you're flirting, you want to get married, and it's okay, so come in and steal me one night. It's definitely you can marry a woman if you kidnap her, and I find it very unnerving that even Ygritte puts the burden of survival on the female side of this equation. How do you guys feel about that?
I feel like I just heard Patrick explaining how in Viking times this was a normal situation.
Well, I think it's troubling, certainly, to think that, at any given time, somebody could just fancy you and come in and swipe you and then you belong to him. I mean, that's obviously a very disturbing dynamic, but I also think that there is something sort of ironically empowering about it as well, in a way that bride theft cultures don't generally include. And I think that sense that the women are trained equal to the men, that like they actually would be able to resist. Whereas I think in a lot of like bride theft scenarios, the bride is completely vulnerable, whereas Ygritte's like, I'm gonna put an arrow in you, you son of a bitch. You know what I mean? Like that there's an element of equality
But
to
what
it.
I don't understand with that is, say someone's after Ygritte and she puts a knife through them. Is there any consequence to that? Like, does she get held to account for that by the other wildlings? Or are they like, fair
No.
enough, he went for her, she didn't want it, too bad he died? I mean, does that just get
Yeah.
let go?
Yeah, I
it's
think
like
that's
the latter.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it behooves you as a man, if you're going to go after a woman, to check she's actually into you. So it's
Well, I
not
think so.
really, so it's not really a kind of bride theft like that.
Well, sure, within wildling culture, but they view this as extending to, like, John notes that, like Rattleshirt can come down and like steal girls, and it's just like, okay, they're his wives now, and like these are northern girls who aren't trained in the arts of warfare. Or like, what if you're a wildling girl who isn't a badass, and like then it puts the burden of your self-defense on you. Like, so I agree there's a certain amount of like egalitarianness to it, in that women are more encouraged by the society to be proactive, but I still think it's like, you just have to be strong enough not to let somebody hurt you, which is a problematic point of view in my opinion.
I think like in this society, I'd rather have the wildling situation, just because like, okay, say you're a Westerosi person who, even like if you're noble born, somebody can just come and pay your father for you and you don't have any say in the matter. Or if you're lower born.
That was Ygritte's point, wasn't it? That
Yeah,
she'd rather be stolen than given away.
Or like if you're lower born, someone could literally come and like take you anyway, and then because you're damaged goods, your father could be like, yeah, you can have her now.
I mean, I'm not saying that a mercantilist, view of matchmaking is preferable to a might makes right view of matchmaking, but it disturbs me how much the wildlings depend on my might makes right. Like, I feel like there's some, maybe it's Tormund, like a character who says like, oh, I have this son and he was super weak, but I kind of loved him anyway, and like he died in the night and he rose as a white knight to kill him. And it was, I could be remembering this wrong because I don't even remember where it comes up, but like it always struck me that the wildlings are an incredibly harsh culture in that way, and like I think we want to, like, we have an urge to idealize them because they do have a lot more male-female equality, and they do have a lot more just equality in general, and that's very appealing, especially when we're immersed in the general culture of Westeros, which is women are property. But I don't want to defend that just because it's slightly better than the alternative.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I feel like
obvious. Go ahead, Tyler.
I feel like the aptest comparison, or the sort of most direct comparison, is not between the kind of arranged marriage for, as you say, like mercantile reasons, but rather the practice on the Iron Islands of taking salt wives. And I think that in that case, there is less of a sense of mutual obligation after the fact of the theft. I think that's one of the things that I find so fascinating about this wildling dynamic, is that like you don't steal a woman unless you're going to marry her. Do you know what I mean? There's no, at least that we're made aware of, like there seems to be very little casual rape or kind of one-off violence, that this is more of a way of the man to prove himself to the woman to whom he wishes to be bonded, right? That it's the formation of a bonded pair. And the salt wife dynamic is, first of all, it's extra cultural, right? That they go and they seek out women who are more vulnerable and who are other people's wives, and which Ygritte finds very repugnant, to think that you would steal somebody else's wife, right? So there's like I picture it almost like lions, right? Which is like, I mean, obviously there's still an animalistic component to it, but that sense that a lioness will beat the crap out of the lion that wants to mate with her before she actually allows him to do that. And then there's a sense that, and then afterwards, like he's responsible for her, he's responsible for the offspring, that there's a commitment on both sides that I think is lacking in pretty much any other dynamic that we've seen.
To me, it's like a survival thing, right? Like, you show your virility on both sides. You wouldn't want to take a woman who, I'm not saying in like modern sensibilities, but like back then, you wouldn't want to take a woman who's just like, oh yeah, I can't fight you off, because will she bear you sons that are strong enough to survive up there? As a woman, you wouldn't want, looking for a partner, you wouldn't want a weak man, because again, who wants to bring a child into the world just so you can watch it die? So I think it's probably developed out of that cultural importance more than anything. And And my point with I think it's better is because at least you're provided an opportunity to have a say so in your own fate that way. Like you are encouraged to be tough enough to fight someone off who is going to harm you or who you don't care for. Whereas, even as like enlightened as Ned was, he didn't want, his little girl to not be a lady kind of thing. Like I don't know. I just think when your culture is largely based on sheer survival, there's not much fun in games. It starts to make a little bit of sense. But I get what you're saying. Oh, it's pretty bad.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we're getting this from Ygritte's perspective, and as I feel like the resident Sansa in most conversations, I'm like, well, I'd be screwed because I'm not a badass, like, so again, it's like, sure, if you're badass enough, and great, but if you're not badass enough, well, you should have been badass enough.
Well, I mean, I think the same could be said of you're like freezing to death, right? Like, I don't know how to build a fire. I can't hunt for my own food. I mean, I would have been a white, like, probably right out of the gate. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's Dr. Blue Blood.
Yes, that's an interesting question. Is Sansa really into all that lady things and princess and songs because that's the culture she's been raised in, where that importance is placed and that's what's apropos for a young woman?
Well, so
or
is
is
Arya.
it because...
Well, it's whether you want to adhere to the given standard of excellence or the sort of preset standard of excellence, or whether you find that benchmark unappealing or unsatisfying, right? Like if you do really well in school and you're satisfied getting all A's on your report card and that is something that you're proud of when it happens, great. But if you would much rather, skip school and work on your art project or your car or whatever, like that, you're creating your own benchmark of excellence and sort of personal achievement. And I think that Sansa's only quote unquote crime, or her only kind of banality, is that she readily accepted and sort of took on to herself the pre-existing benchmark of her society, right? So she excels at what she was told to excel at, which doesn't make her any less excellent. It just makes her, I guess, more of a standard.
Well, I don't think that she's not necessarily physically weak either. There's nothing in there that says she's got like bird bones. She never
her nickname is literally Bird.
Power.
Little Bird, yeah.
Yeah.
But do you know what I'm saying? Is like we think of Arya as being tough and strong, but she's raised herself up to that, and I think that in other circumstances, Sansa very well could have, but perhaps Arya would be the more Ygritte type, where she's off on a raiding party, and Sansa would be the more I'll stay back with everyone else and the children, and we'll cook.
Like a Dala or a who's Mance Rayder's wife?
Yeah, Dala.
Who's a Dala? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's anybody who's barefoot in the kitchen in their culture, or like a homemaker. Whatever the wildly that is, that's probably what Sansa would be, I'm guessing.
I think this relates to the question of the way that bride stealing works and that kind of relationship dynamic. But I was very struck by Ygritte's mother's saying that a man can own a woman or own a knife, but never both. And I wondered what you guys thought about that, because it seemed very pertinent, but I couldn't quite put my finger on like what she meant by it.
Yeah, I was trying to make sense of that and I couldn't do it. I mean, I guess either you can be a violent person or you can be a husband, maybe, and like the two wouldn't go together. I guess we don't really... I mean, Mance and Dala seem to have a very loving relationship, but they're really the only wildling couple, or pure wildling couple, that we see, so we don't really have any other... Yeah, I don't know, but then you're also like, but harm a dog's head. Like, so which one is she owning? Is it you can own a man or you can own a knife, or like,
or dogs?
Right.
I don't know. I thought that was very striking. Like,
yeah, wildling culture is strange. It's weird, guys.
It's so cold.
It seems like one of those archaic phrases your mom would tell you like back in the 50s, like, okay, on your wedding night, just lay back and pretend you like it. And it just seems weird to me, because I don't know, what is that supposed to mean? I really did enjoy the quaintness in this chapter of, oh my God, look at that castle. And he's like, you're an idiot. You haven't seen anything. It's just some busted ass grain silo.
Yeah.
Calm down, I thought that was really true. Like, that's exactly how those people would react. They'd probably seen only a handful of structures man-made in their lives, you know.
Yeah, sure.
And yeah, I felt in this chapter that on the one hand, you have John being quite condescending towards the wildlings, and yet all the information you're given in this chapter is about how man has failed, right? So there's no point being that proud of Westeros. I mean, maybe you're able to build a great big tower, but, you know, we get all the detail about how the gift has gone to ruin, about how, you know, wildlings and raiders have threatened harvests and all the people living in that part of the world, and they've had to progressively move south. I mean, the overarching sort of feeling you get when you've read this chapter is, my God, you know, how foolish to let this go to ruin, and when did the rot start? It's, I don't know, I really was impressed for the first time what it means when the wall comes down. I mean, not because of supernatural things, but just law and order going to pot. And what that means for the gift. It's pretty depressing. And when did it start? I mean, I guess that's my question. Is this something that happened in Robert's Rebellion, or is this something that's been going on far, far earlier than that?
Oh, I think it's quite a long time happening.
Yeah, given the decay of the village, I'd say definitely over 20 years, right? You know, and when was the last time they had winter? Was, what, 10 years ago? So I'm going to say probably like the summer before that, at least.
Yeah. By the way, is this the first time we get the phrase "a dream for spring"? I know it's not a dream of spring, but is that the first
I noticed
time?
that too.
Maybe.
Yeah. Some other little things I noticed is there's a reference to the Red Slaughter, capital R, capital S, which I thought was sort of nice as we go towards the Red Wedding. And also the phrase "discipline beats valor," which is very true. We're going to see that played out. Remind me a lot of Rome fighting, you know, sort of the hordes in Germany and other places. And I really loved the final line of the chapter is just George at his best. He wrote till dawn and the stars stared down like eyes. It's so paranoid. It's so, it's romantic, but at the same time it's questioning and intrusive. And I think that's where John is, right? Like, he's questioning who he is and does he have a sense of honor, and he's just betrayed Ygritte. And I love it that he sees this panoply of stars and they're all trained on him.
Yeah, because John feels judged no matter what he does. I mean, like, that's, you know,
He is.
Well, sure, we're judging him. But, you know, I mean, like, it's an annoying but I guess noble part of his character that he, I don't know, like, no matter what he does, he thinks he's doing something wrong, which, I mean, I guess you want in a character more than constantly thinking that they're right all the time, but it does become kind of a drag to read a little bit.
Yeah.
And maybe that's part of his problem, like at the end of Dance, you know, he becomes so convinced of his own, you know, righteousness that it doesn't even like occur to him that, like, hey, people around you are like not only not happy, but like super not happy.
Well, because he was raised in an environment where he was wrong simply for existing, right? So, I mean, that becomes, I would think, a completely untenable way to live on some level, right? So, I mean, I can understand why he wanted to go to the wall in the first place and sort of start over again in a way that so many people do when they take the black. And it's interesting. It's very interesting to see. And I think we've talked about this on past rereads too, that that foundational sort of fundamental psychological impact that like Kat's treatment of him has had, where he's, I mean, on one hand, he's so paranoid about fathering a bastard, but then also just this constant self-questioning and sort of self-devaluation, where, you know, not only can he not do the right thing, but to what extent does his existence really even matter because he's going to get it wrong anyway? You know, I mean, it's just, it's
I completely agree. And I see in this that John is the creation or the victim of what everyone else has put on him, and this is a rational response. And I know some people get quite tired of his introspection, but I find it both tragic and indeed admirable in a set of books where so often we have characters who aren't self-aware, or who, in being aware, sort of have no empathy or don't course correct. I find it quite admirable that John does consider what do his vows mean, what is the benefit of being in Wildling society relative to Westerosi society, and he's kind of exploring. And I think, Mikhail, I know it was a throwaway comment about, you know, he's like the undergrad, the first year student who just figured out Nietzsche, but there is something about that in him, that he's wandered out from this very enclosed world at Winterfell, this very privileged world, where, okay, he's been arguably systematically sort of put down and bullied, but he's entering this big wide world. He's had this huge experience with Corin and the Wildlings. And okay, it manifests as a kind of paranoia about the stars, but I do like the fact that he's constantly churning it over. And, you know, I know we, on this podcast, we get very down on John. I see something to admire in this chapter, I guess.
Yeah, no, he's not. I mean, he's so easy to make fun of, you know. and I think part of it is just that he's John and he is the prototypical male, you know, growing boy hero. So to me, it's more fun to make fun of that than it is to necessarily like dive deep into his psychology. But I don't think any of you guys are wrong. You know, I think it's actually interesting how much of his old ambition occasionally still peeks through, where he's like, hey, I could have had one of these castles. And that's a thought that's very different from kind of the rest of his attitude. But it's a fascinating vestige of who he used to be.
And I also like the idea that with John, we're seeing him go through this journey, and I know that most of us think he will be resurrected, and maybe won't be as messed up as Lady Stoneheart or as different from John Prime, so to say. But I like the idea that he might become more of the selfish, ambitious John, who does want what is his, and isn't as concerned with the Starks because they've wronged him. I'd almost like to see the Black Spider-Man version of John. I think that'd be quite fun.
No, I agree, and I wonder, you know, if we go with a logic that certainty is his fatal flaw in that moment toward the end of Dance. I mean, what does that make him when he comes back? Like, you know, does that make certainty? Does he double down on that? You know, Stoneheart certainly has. Is there an elimination of doubt and a purification of purpose, or you know, is he stuck in the like, why was I reborn? You know.
Yeah. I mean, I'm concerned, Bina, about that direction for him, simply because he starts to sound more and more like a Theon to me in that possibility, right? That I mean, Theon really started fucking things up when he decided just to go for it, right? And like claim what was his and kind of try and shake that, you know, shake the yoke of inauspicious stars, like shake that kind of unfortunate beginning that he had and really strike it on his own as his own man and kind
what
of
could go wrong, really?
Right, exactly. Right. Like, so I mean, I feel like we've had a very unfortunate precedent for a character who set off in that direction, and so I would be concerned, not with, you know, Black Spider-Man John. Like I really do. I mean, I think I said on something before that I really want to see like a Pet Cemetery John, right, where like he needs to come back weird or else I'm going to be really disappointed.
Yeah, but I feel that there's a certain amount that George R.R. Martin will allow Theon to do as a secondary character. He will explore more extreme personality changes and decision fuck-ups that he probably won't allow John to experience. And I'm curious to see just how much hero armor John gets in the next book. I think a lot of the criticism that, you know, someone like a Silence would make of John, I think we won't truly know if that's valid until the next couple books and we see just how truly protected he is.
Yeah, I mean, I know people who don't think that John is going to be a POV character anymore because he's just going to.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
On the grounds of what? That he comes back as some weird walk type thing?
Or, yeah, just that he doesn't have that point of view. Like, you know, we go from Catelyn to Stoneheart and we don't get a point of view there, even though she plays a pretty prominent role in a lot of the Riverland storyline. So I think the argument would be that John comes back, but not enough to go into his head. I mean, I don't know, because I don't know that George is going to want to sacrifice, you know, that huge of a POV. But I think it's definitely an option given the precedent that we've seen before.
It would make Sam more interesting, assuming they eventually get reunited. All the POVs around John that then take over the narrative burden, I feel. It'd be daring. I would really respect him if he did that. I'm just not sure. I don't know, Amber, like you haven't been on, I don't know, you've not been on for a while. So what's your view on John? Do you like him, love him, respect him, hate him?
I don't think there are any characters I really feel passionate about enough to hate. It's been a while since I was about through the first book of the reread, and then I just couldn't keep up. So I haven't actually read any of these chapters in a long time. And I can see, I mean, actually in this chapter he grates more bothersome to me. But I mean, I can see why people get annoyed with him, but I think he's a perfectly fine protagonist, and he does have depth, and he does have that background of, you know, if not emotional abuse, then certainly, you know, just living in a world without a lot of love. I mean, I think Ned was good to him, but he wasn't probably very loving. And that'll fuck you up.
So the interesting question is whether you think Ned was less loving towards John than Rob and Bran, because you can imagine Ned being that kind of like aloof British pub private school sort of boarding school guy and not openly showing affection. Do you think John would have felt it from Cat or also from Ned?
I feel like Ned would have treated him differently anytime Cat was around.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no. It makes sense. Because clearly Ned's not gonna put his foot down and say, this is my son, treat him with respect. He just kind of lets her steamroll John.
I mean, so I put a lot of this on Ned because he did really do that. He did put his foot down and say, this is my son, treat him with respect, and like the set. I guess I'm so protective of Catelyn that like it's difficult for me to have conversations about John because I think it's completely valid to say that she traumatized him and didn't provide, he was left without a mother figure. But I put so much of that on Ned and his stupid secrecy and like, utter lack of prediction as to how Catelyn would react to this and how he could expect her to react that I don't know.
Yeah.
I can feel the hate comments being written in the post.
Well, I am certainly not a Cat hater. And he did come home and say, okay, this is my kid, respect him. But he didn't say, this is my kid, treat him as you would treat your own child. Like, and he did, Ned definitely was to blame for a lot of that.
Do you feel like they're kind of like George V and Mary of Teak? Is that how you say? Queen Elizabeth's grandparents? Like, notoriously, like, they loved each other, but they never talked to each other openly. Like, they would literally, like, write each other in letters. I feel like if they were alive today, they'd, like, be the people that text each other in the same room. They couldn't communicate their feelings, but, like, by all accounts, they did love each other, and they had, like, a billion children, but they were both notoriously, like, hard parents and distant with their children.
Ned and Cat were very loving. I never got the impression that they were, certainly from Cat, because as often as she thinks about Ned and misses him and sort of regrets that he's not there to advise her or to advise their children, I got the impression for sure that like they were very much partners in a lot of what happened.
I think there's a big difference though between like loving and being affectionate.
For sure.
With each other and with your children, like my husband and I aren't gonna like make out on the couch in front of our son, but I do want him to see us
that's good
hugging,
to know, Hannah.
Yeah, right.
or having like like a quick peck on the cheek. I think it's healthy for him to see that we are in love and we can demonstrate it in an appropriate way.
Yeah.
You don't have to repress that.
We have so little evidence, but I can't imagine like we don't know what like the normal standard operating procedure was at Winterfell or between Ned and Cat. But I mean, George deliberately shows them having sex, like almost the first time we meet them. I think we can assume based on that their relationship was actually remarkably healthy and loving for their circumstances, and I don't know. I think part of the John versus Catelyn debate is also confusing because we don't know exactly who treated who how. We don't like John notes that he isn't allowed to sit at the the head table when the Lannisters are there, but he does normally. So like it's hard to tell. Like there's absolutely no question that Catelyn was cold and unresponsive to him and vastly preferred her own children, but that it's hard to say exactly where that manifested. Like he's been educated with the boys, he has grown up with them, almost the same. It's almost like it's like a scarlet bee on him, So he's
my point was like my husband and I, we demonstrate in front of our son that we are engaged in a loving, healthy relationship.
Yeah, but this is medieval.
Would they do that in front of John? Like if John suddenly walked in the room, would she go cold toward Ned?
Maybe.
Probably.
Maybe. But actually, I'm not sure if she would be
warm.
I'm not sure she would be warm towards Ned in front of any of her children, because I'm not sure that's aristocratic behaviour in a sort of faux medieval world. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure they would be, just demonstrating affection in that way. We don't see it with other aristo couples, do we? Although, in fairness, we don't see many happily married aristo couples in this world.
It's not about Cat and Ned, but I was very interested in the world building in this chapter, the sort of small details that were peppered in, not just with the wildlings, but with the sort of world more generally. And one of them that I found very striking was when he's thinking about whether or not to kill the old man, and they keep saying it's an old man, and then he finally says, he's an old man, 50, maybe even 60. He's led a longer life than most, and I found that very poignant and also very telling in terms of the world in general, and how harsh and short these lives are that are all around, like that. He's like, well, he made it to 60, like he's doing way better than most people, and it just, I don't know, I thought that was very interesting.
We should probably take it as a signal to move on to the next chapter, which is probably more logically as George R. R. Martin has it, the preceding chapter, which is Bran 3, happens on the same day, and I believe it's Hannah with the summary.
It is, and in retrospect, I feel like this is kind of long, so sorry, but also not sorry. Bran and his companions arrive at a village near a lake, hosting a tower standing proud on an island in the water. Mira goes ahead to case the joint, displacing some deer in the process. As summer tears off after them, Bran longs to slip in and run with his familiar. Jojen inquires about the masters of the lands before them. Hodor says Hodor, and Bran reveals that they belong to the Night's Watch. The Gift, it is called. His forebear, Brandon the Builder, had initially given all tracts of land spanning south of the Wall for 25 leagues to the Black Brothers in perpetuity. Over a millennia later, Queen Alysanne, upon her visit to the ice boundary, being so impressed by the efforts of the vigilant Night's Watch, doubled the gift to 50 leagues of territory south of the frozen shield wall. The village is clearly long since abandoned, the homes and hovels in disrepair, and the inn is rooming a grove of apple trees rather than travelers these days. Alas, none are edible. Jojen muses, why good developed land like this would be empty of people? Where'd they go, Bran? Hodor, asks Hodor. Bran summarizes they've fled for fear of wildling raiders. Jojen insists they should stop there for the night, as a storm is approaching. A bad one, he says. Seeing the truth of that evident on the western skyline, Bran urges the Holdfast to be the only suitable shelter in this ruinous rural vestige. And Hodor agrees. Hodor. Mira points out there's no boat to ferry them across the water to the tower. Bran relays to them the presence of a hidden causeway, virtually invisible to those unaware of its existence. Old Nan had told him of it. Again, Mira leads the way through the uncharted water, using her frog spirit to find a route through the switchback stone path camouflaged just under the water's surface. It wasn't easy going. Hodor nearly slipped twice, risking drowning both he and his lordling riding in his basket upon the great man's back. To which he exclaims, Hodor! They reach the island and enter the tower. Hodor attempts to slay the set of oxidized iron bars that stand sentry before the winding staircase leading to the upper rooms. But even rusted and forgotten by the occupants they'd been forged to protect, the bars hold their post unyielding. They try a murder hole instead, this time successfully, and ascend the stairs, and 5 floors later they reach the summit. Upon the roof, the storm has made quite the advance, turning the bright, clear day they left by the lakeside into an overcast, wind-riddled mess. Despite the gathering darkness, Mira exclaims she feels like a giant looking out over the world, given the view from the slender stone spear they've scaled, standing solitary in the sprawling low grasslands around the structure. Bran laments they cannot see the wall from this perch, but he admits how foolish that notion would have been, as the wall is still most likely 50 leagues away. He has a wave of weariness run through him as he thinks of the long distance still to be traversed, and Hodor thinks Hodor. Bran asks Jojen how they can hope to get through the massive ice wall. Jojen replies there'll be abandoned castles scattered all along its length. Ghost castles, Old Nan had named them. He remembers having to learn the names of all 19 and reciting them for Benjen when King Robert had visited Winterfell. Bran suggests it'll be easier to go directly to Castle Black and demand passage, but Jojen cautions that not all Black brothers are brave and noble men like his half-brother and uncle, and anyone might betray them. Bran tries to argue his case, but Jojen suddenly quiets him. There's a rider approaching the lifeless village below. Mira urges them inside before they're spotted. Bran raises concern for his that his direwolf is still down in the village, and the siblings reassure their lord Summer will be fine. The single rider books a room in the roofless, dilapidated inn and strikes up a campfire. Bran, cold and travel-worn, wishes to also have a fire, but the Reeds insist the risk is too great. Their position must not be given away. They sup on cold duck caught by the Cranach huntress the previous day. Bran has storytelling duty this night and relates the tale of Brandon the Shipwright, legendary seafarer, who sailed beyond the sunset sea. The storm had come on them by the end of the retelling. The rain was falling and dusk was turning into night. Restless, Hodor paced the tower room. A lightning bolt rips through the atmosphere, sending the huge stable boy into a blind panic. Hodor, he cries. Multiple attempts by the children are made to calm him, but still he screams, Hodor, Hodor, in increasing terror. As lightning continues to strike, Jojen looks out and declares more men have appeared down in the village, too many to count. Bran worry they'll come to the tower for shelter, but Mira says they won't find the causeway. That she barely could, knowing it was there and where to look for it. Further fury from the weather sees Hodor spiraling into a fit of unadulterated Hodoring, most of which is covered up by the clapping, rolling thunder. But in the calm intervals, he threatens to give them away. Bran screams at the great man, and he is suddenly dumbfounded and contrite. As he sits down, faintly breathing, Mira whispers to the Stark boy, "What have you done?" "Nothing," he insists. "I don't know." But he knows he slipped into Hodor, and the shock of the intrusion was enough to calm the manservant. Jojen is confident they will never be found in the storm in the dark, but if the men below, who are by all accounts not Night's Watch, should remain come the dawn, they might be in serious trouble. Bran reaches for Summer, and inside the wolf he hears the sounds and smells the smells of men and fear. End of.
Well, Bina, I'll tell you right now, my only note was I like the use of the verb hodoring. That was my deep thought for the chapter.
Yeah, I was going to say unadulterated hodoring is now my favorite phrase. It's awesome.
This is the start of a very dark place for Bran. I've spent hours thinking about Bran working into Hodor and like the implications of it and what it really is. George is so insidious because I still think like at this point Bran is doing this on his own in Dance with Dragons because it feels good and he wants to. That's basically mind rape. I wouldn't qualify that here. It starts as so necessary and unintentional, qualities that could never obviously be applied to rape.
Yeah, almost like a reaction, just like a knee jerk.
Yeah, and I mean, I even kind of give Bran a little. It's getting ahead, but I give him a little slack when the whites roll around them when they're outside of the tree, and like literally their only choice is to fight or that they're going to be slaughtered. But it gets like the inevitable trajectory of it is so awful that like these early examples are really tough for me to read.
Well, I think it was fascinating the way that this concept was even introduced because he starts out reaching physically and then it slips from just in the publication, it slips into italics with the last reaching, right? So every time Hodor runs by him, he reaches out physically and he's reaching. And then the last one is reaching with his mind. And the fluidity of that transition, I think, is also a very fascinating reflection on how important this identity of warging and then later of sort of more developed three-eyed ravenhood is to Bran as a substitute for his physical loss. That he could have caught Hodor if he hadn't been pushed out that window, and he could be acting physically, and the fluidity of that translation between physical action and mental action, I think, is one that is really fascinatingly and very succinctly articulated here.
Well, what I like is like he doesn't do it clearly intentionally. Like you said, it's just a fluid movement, but it's so quick, and then he knows it was wrong. Like Mira's like, "What did you do?" And then I in my head I imagine her kind of scathingly like, "What have you done?" But she may have just been like, "What'd you do to get him to stop?" But he still feels compelled to lie. Like he knows what he did was wrong. He could feel it, that he had crossed a line, and it's just really subtle though in the writing. And then it's, we get it later, how grave of a boundary that he's crossed, into. which is one thing I like about George's writing. It just, there's always more to be said. He writes with the assumption that his reader is of a certain intelligence and doesn't need their hand held through these stories, because it's definitely not something that I thought of as being all that bad until much later in the series. And then we kind of get it from inside Hodor's perspective, where he's cowering in like the corner of his mind and just letting it happen, where a more willful person would actively fight out, somebody doing that to them.
Well, as we see in the prologue, right, with Farmer Sixskins, yeah. And I wonder to what extent that perspective makes what Bran is doing that much more shocking, because it is such a violent reaction from the wildling woman who's willing to destroy herself in order to prevent what's happening.
Yeah, well, she kind of seems to know what he's doing too, which I think lends that. Like, she knows it's live or die at that point, right? He's gonna take over. So, it's kind of like, well, if I can't have my body, you can't either, type of thing. Whereas I don't think either of them really know really what's happening in this moment, like the whole thing of it, And it's just like I said in the review or the summary, an intrusion, even an unintentional one, but he knows that he's violated something pretty big. And I think just the evidence there that he's willing or compelled to lie. It's like when you get caught doing something as a kid and you might not have thought it was that bad, but you should lie about it. It's sad.
Yeah, it's just getting worse, so.
I want to make a minor and very trivial point. How is it that when you split up food, Hodor only gets a quarter? He's like 4 times the size of the other people. He's Mahusiv. He should get more of the food.
Well, and he's working for 2 people on their travels. Like, he should definitely get more.
Hashtag justice for Hodor. I mean, I know it's not the biggest deal. I know it's not the biggest deal he has to deal with this chapter, but a full belly goes a long way.
Well, why does Mira have to hunt a duck for them? Like, hello, Summer, you need to pull your weight.
Yeah, because he does say later he has a belly full of venison or whatever, and you're like, you can't bring that shit closer to the tower, dude. Like, yeah.
It's actually, they really don't use the direwolves for mundane purposes. If you think about it, like they really don't. Like, it would seem obvious that if you can control a wolf with your mind, you would have it hunt for you and bring back the food, but they never do that.
Can't you just like ask him though too? Like,
I don't know. I feel like there's maybe it's when like Bran is in Summer, he wouldn't want to obey that. Like, he doesn't care anymore. He rarely wants to come back.
Isn't that one of the exercises that Jojen tells him to do when he first starts warging lessons? Like, kill something but don't eat it, or just leave it. Maybe I'm misremembering it, but I thought it was a test to see like how much control he had over whether he could relinquish a prey that he had brought down. But I could be misremembering.
I mean, we do know that Bran is just really bad at this, so.
It's certainly much more voyeuristic than it is practical at this point, isn't it? Like, he just wants to be along for the ride, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I almost view him as like he has an addiction to this physicality, He and like he is kind of like an addict who was forcibly detoxed. And then gets a taste and can't resist anymore. And like, I guess if it were just Summer, even if Bran lost his mind, I guess it wouldn't be hurting anybody really. But once the urge to feel physicality in other forms than just Summer like gets sparked in Bran, which I think it starts to do here, it gets really, really dark. And it makes things like Jojen paste just eminently reasonable, even if it's probably bullshit. But
I think he eats Jojen. I'm.
Are you on team?
I'm on the Jojen paste train. Yeah, for sure.
Ooh, dude.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I'm on that too, though. But who doesn't think they're eating Jojen paste? Anyone?
Me?
I wouldn't be surprised if they were not.
Oh, okay.
I'm really uncomfortable by the term Jojen paste, so I tend not to think about it too hard.
Like, maybe they're bleeding Jojen and putting the blood in the meal, but I don't think it's like his body. I mean, maybe, like, I'm not discounting the possibility. Obviously, there's evidence for it, but it's too dark for me to be like, that's definitely happening. And Jojen has gone on about, the importance of his fate so much that, I don't know.
I think, I picture it as like how you would put like brown sugar in cream of wheat, right? Where like, like the cream of wheat would be the weirwood taste. And then, exactly. And then you just have like a swirl of Jojen for like, extra potency. I don't know.
Jojen blood and cream of tree.
Cream of tree. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like that's kind of.
It reminds me of like, have you ever seen that Treehouse of Horror on The Simpsons where it's like the two aliens? And they're like, how to cook humans, and then it's like blows dust off the books. How to cook 4 humans. They blow more dust off the books. Like how to cook 40 humans. Like
that's brilliant. That is brilliant.
It does stick out to me that a lot of the stuff to discuss in terms of history was definitely rehashed in the Jon chapter.
Mm-hmm. I was interested in the Brandon the shipwright mention. Like I googled that, and I guess we don't know much about him beyond what they say here. But the fact that he went west, I thought was very interesting because there really isn't much thought given to what might be west of Westeros.
I was going to ask this, and wouldn't it be obvious that someone would try and go west? So, do we have people who have like the Lands of Ice and Fire of the map books? Is there anything out there? Or maybe
I mean, it out right now.
And I haven't read the Worlds of Ice and Fire to my shame. So, does that?
So there's an island out past the Iron Islands called the Lonely Light, which is like as far as any known person has gone to and come back from.
Well, I think George has confirmed that there are continents, I guess, beyond the 4 that we know, but he doesn't care. I guess he's like, yeah, sure, they're there. And so, I mean, I don't know that there's too much thinking about, but I did just think it was nice. Again, it's sort of a throwaway almost world building where it's like, yes, there is something beyond these things that we're so intensely focused on.
It's a little bit of a theme, right? And characters kind of going off to explore distant realms and kind of fading into legend, or I'm thinking of like Garyon Lannister.
Mm-hmm.
Well, to a certain extent, Benjen Stark falls into that category.
Yeah, and Euron also.
Oh, if only he had stayed gone.
I know, right? It is funny if he's the only one who doesn't come back from this kind of trip.
I do like the idea that here be dragons could be a legitimate map marking in this world. Like, oh crap, there actually are dragons here.
Anything else on the chapter?
I was wondering, can anyone name all 19 castles?
West to east and then east to west.
I think we tried to do that in the World of Ice and Fire episode, and we were reading them and barely got through them all.
No, a few of them.
That is, I mean, it really does emphasize the sort of malignant neglect that has overtaken that we were kind of talking about in the last chapter, where like how long would this gift have to have been ignored in order to fall into such disarray? But how long and how kind of devastating a downslide has the watch been on, that you went from having 19 castles being illegitimate, and I know they said they were only ever 17 manned at once, but to barely being able to populate 2, 3 maybe. I don't know. It very much is a sense of decay that comes from complacency that I think is very tragic, particularly in light of the consequences that it's almost definitely going to have with this rising threat in the north.
Well, it's interesting to me that like the view, everyone's view is, why do we have the wall? We have the wall to keep out the wildlings, and we don't really need to man every castle. Like, we're good with like 2 or 3 because it's just the wildlings, and nobody kind of goes back and thinks like, well, we built 19 and this thing is like 1,000 miles long or whatever it is, and 700 feet high. Like, are we sure it's for the wildlings?
Yeah, like at what point did we think that was necessary, and maybe why would both really be good questions to ask.
Yeah, you would think, but I mean, it's a lack. I think a lot of what I see in this series is kind of a theme of a lack of vision and curiosity. The characters who possess that are the ones who come across the information that's going to save the whole world, like Sam. And it's a tide that's incredibly difficult to work against. So you have characters like Mormont, who knows what needs to be done, but you can't give somebody else vision. It's something that has to be within each person. So. Yeah, it's I don't know, it's a challenge that I think is very I personally think that's why a lot of people are drawn to the series, because it feels so realistic in that way of like, you know, there being a bigger threat, like whether or not like you believe it's global warming or you think it's like whatever force is on the planet. I feel like everybody kind of has a hierarchy in their mind of like, this is the big deal, and then there's smaller deals. And the fact that it's so clearly defined in this series, and yet people continue to squabble and have their own versions of the big deal, is very astute on George's part, and I think it makes the whole series very relatable.
I agree, and I think that climate change analogy is amazing. We all know it's important. There are some people who dissent. Unfortunately, some are powerful, and meanwhile we squabble, and the inevitable will arrive, and it's So as much as I said John shouldn't be so condescending towards the wildlings, given what man has allowed to happen at the wall and the decay, I guess we shouldn't be so condescending towards the Watch for letting the wall fall into decay either, because we're all doing the same shit.
Yeah, there's a Maester Aemon quote about it. I'm trying to find it, but I don't know. It's something like, you know, the realm keeps fighting and winter coming every day and the threat growing larger. I don't remember what it was, but he has so many quotes that when you Google Maester Aemon quotes, you get a million that are not this quote. So,
it says that Bran the Builder's mentioned in Clash of Kings or Shipwright. I guess when they're down in the crypts, somebody asks about it, and then his son is known as Brandon the Burner because he burned his father's ship in grief when he never came back. That's all we know about him.
Seems very counterproductive.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Okay, are we ready to move on to the next chapter? Sounds like we've explored Queen's Crown to its fullest. Okay, so the next linear event after Bran 3 is that the survivors of Craster's Keep reach Castle Black on December the 13th, 9 days later. Seems like a plausible amount of time. On December 14th, we return to Cat 6. She's just arrived at Twins, and this is 9 chapters and 110 pages later in my version of the published order. So I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that sort of Craster's Keep timeline. Otherwise, we can push on to Cat 6, which I believe Sarah, so...
I did, yeah. I just had a little bit of a panic attack that I was supposed to have done a summary for some kind of Craster's Keep arrival. Like, yeah. I thought it was Cat. But, yeah, okay. I mean, yeah. Right. The chapter begins as Robb, Catelyn, his entourage, and his forces approach the Twins. Cat urgently reminds Robb to partake of refreshments that are offered, or to request some if they are not, in order to secure the safety of guest right as soon as possible under Walder Frey's roof. They are greeted outside the gates by a small contingent of Frey men, led by Sir Raymond, Frey's eldest grandson and heir to the Twins. Greywind growls and charges at the Frey party, and Cat is forced to intervene, intercepting Greywind before he can reach the men. The wolf also balks and howls forebodingly at the entrance to the castle, and Robb leaves him outside with the remaining Westerling before entering Walder's Great Hall. In the hall, they suffer through an uncomfortable audience with the grotesque child, Lord Frey, who forces Robb to apologize to all of his daughters for breaking their betrothal. Edmure is delighted with the look of his bride-to-be, Rosalind, and Cat remembers, before leaving the hall, to request the refreshments that will secure their guest right. Catelyn dismisses Edmure's misgivings about Frey granting him such a beautiful bride, but, after changing into dry clothes, nevertheless visits the maester to allay any concerns about Rosalind's fertility. Returning to Robb's chambers, Catelyn receives the latest news from Lord Bolton, who offers her the strip of skin Ramsay flayed from Theon Greyjoy's finger before lamenting his disastrous and likely deliberate tardiness at the Trident and rehashing the northern losses at Duskendale. The chapter ends as Robb announces his plans to return home after the wedding.
It's really sad and creepy.
Now I really feel like mine was long. Thank you.
I honestly feel reading this chapter, I was like, there's so much foreshadowing, there's so much evil build-up. How did I not know what was coming? It's just every other paragraph has a line. You know, gatehouses emerge like ghosts. There's banners like drowned cats. She literally is going to drown. You know, she tells Robb to actively seek guest right. Greywind is like freaking out. He knows something's off. I mean, the whole thing is just so...
Frey was so not subtle too. Like he has a lot of kind of throwaway things, but the one that really got my attention was he was like, "Oh yes, the red will run." Yeah, he said the red will run.
Yeah.
Everything.
Everyone knows it's off. Duncan / Valkyrist was very eloquent on this. That it's like they've been walking in a funeral procession. No one wants to be there, and the grim inevitability is heartbreaking.
I was actually very struck, particularly with Duncan's points in mind, by how much of this chapter builds tension not through the kind of pessimistic funerary imagery that we got in the Old Stones chapter, which immediately preceded this, where it seems like the ground itself is trying to keep them from getting where they're going. But in this chapter, I was surprised to see the extent to which those fears are simultaneously built and allayed through Kat's sort of very consistent observations that things are going better than she expected. And so we have, this was uncomfortable for Rob, but he knew it was coming and he did it great. And it's so nice to be dry again. And she's got a warm gown on and the chambers are nicer than they expected. And Rosalind is more beautiful than Edmure hoped. And, so there are all of these things that, even in the midst of, or in sort of direct juxtaposition to Grey Wind's freaking out and all of these things, that still manage to give us this little glimmer that, like, okay, maybe this isn't going to be as bad as we thought, or as we, maybe we were overreacting, or maybe we were overthinking it, and in the same way that they were. And I think Admire says, like, oh man, that wine actually wasn't bad. I expected him to, piss in a cup and have us praise the vintage, and that makes Kat uneasy, but she also has to agree that it did go a lot better than, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. I thought that was fascinating in terms of the kind of psychological warfare that George is waging on the reader.
Basically he's throwing us off, isn't he? And that's why we don't necessarily register all the kind of obvious foreshadowing, because he's just playing with us. But it's still uneasiness. It's too good. Like, actually she gets sent to a room, Kat, and it's like, oh, this is actually quite comfortable. It's and also, I suspect that for Walder Frey, there's an element of celebration. He wants good wine, partly because he wants to get them drunk, but because to him, this is the eve of a great victory. And so there is an element of, I don't know, subconscious celebration in this.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I don't know if it's subconscious. I actually think Walder Frey would have tremendous pleasure in celebrating the Starks' demise with them.
Yeah, he's going to enjoy the delicious irony of it, I think.
Yeah.
I think it's easy to not see what happens coming, though, because, like, who does that shit? Who writes that much about a character just to kill it off? Like, it doesn't happen. George's writing is so unprecedented, which is what makes it brilliant, but it's so hard to see these things coming because no one else is bold enough to do those kinds of things.
Do you think that in retrospect, Rob not being a POV character was a tip-off?
Mm-hmm. I definitely do, yeah. Well, even like I knew this was coming because I'd seen the show through season 3 and 4 when I read them, but I still kept waiting for like a Rob chapter. You know what I mean? Like, I read Game of Thrones, I read Clash, and I'm like waiting for him to have a Rob chapter because I thought, well, it's a show, so maybe it's different. Like, really naively thinking, well, that's what they did on the show, but maybe that's not how it goes down in the book.
Yeah, none of the Kings do, and Catelyn has a POV, so I don't really think that was as much of a tip off. I also think that George is really good at lulling us in. I mean, maybe if you're the type of person who is like reading with your super ego all the time and are constantly conscious that you're reading a story that's been constructed by an author, then you can pick this kind of thing out. But like, we haven't had a Stark or such an intimate disaster since Ned's death, and that felt very singular. Like, Renly dies, that's super shocking, but like, okay, we have Blackwater, very dramatic, very intense, but not catastrophic. I don't think that we've been, I feel like we always revert to the like, okay, bad thing happened, now everything's going to be okay as readers. Because it's very difficult to be in that point of view of like something worse is going to happen, which is actually the attitude I've started to take toward the series, but toward Game of Thrones, that is. But yeah, I don't think, like, it is really clear once you read it, but I think I would think less of George if people were like, the Freys are plotting and the Boltons were involved and the Lannisters set this up and and they're all going to be slaughtered, like you can predict a certain amount of disaster, but the complete annihilation of the Stark forces, I think, is an unprecedented and galling act, even on George's part, and part of what made his reputation. I think if Ned Stark if this hadn't happened, or if maybe just Robb had been assassinated and Catelyn had survived or something, and it was like, we have to find Bran, like, where is he? We think he might be alive or whatever, or Jon. Personally, I think the Red Wedding is a turning point. And I mean, we're going to talk about this, I think, in more depth when we get to the Red Wedding, but I think that it's part of what cemented his reputation. And now looking back, we're like, why didn't we see this? Well, we didn't have this reputation back then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Amber, can you remember what it was like when you first read it? Like, did you see it coming, or were you spoiled already?
No, I just the first time I read them I read them super, super quick after the first episode or season of the show. And honestly, I don't even like reading this chapter now and picking up all the clues and the dire, tone and mood. It's more affecting now, having known what was happening, because the first time around I was just like, oh, read. Okay, they're dead. Okay, next thing. Ooh, they sewed the wolf head onto him. That's gross. It didn't affect me nearly as much. Like, I didn't throw any books or toss any tables. Just like, okay, next thing, next book. So.
Okay. Makes sense. Mikhail, sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh, no. I mean, My experience is actually very mundane, so.
Okay. Other stuff on the chapter? More stuff on what we've already been discussing?
I don't totally understand. I mean, I guess it's maybe just the function of being an aristocratic woman and the head of a family, but Kat seems like super obsessed with childbirth.
I know.
She meets someone. She's like, "Hi, nice to meet you. Childbirth is going to be a nightmare for you." I don't know. It's a very, like I said, I mean, I think it's probably very much a function of like her understanding of the dynastic dynamic from a female perspective, like the woman's part in that sort of perpetuation of a dynasty. But like, damn, woman, like she scoped out all the other ones. She's like, I like those Craycalls better. Like, wide hips to bear children, big breasts to nurse them, strong arms to carry them. The Craycalls have always been a big boned family and strong. And it's just, it's such a one track thing for her.
It's like the only currency that matters. It's how she places value on people.
Yeah. So if this had not gone down how it had, and Robb were to pick a wife, do you think she would have so strongly counseled him, or would she have been a little softer on his desire to have a pretty wife? And would he have cared? Would he have paid attention to her? Because a lot of them sound hideous.
She's such a nightmare. She always has some fucking comment.
Oh, see, I love Kat. I was really excited to do this chapter because it occurred to me as I was summarizing it that she is, unless I'm overlooking someone major, like she's the only grown-up point of view that we have until Feast Dance. Is that accurate? I mean, Ned, right? But only very, relatively briefly.
Jamie, yeah.
Would you really call Jamie grown up? I don't know. I got
Kat a grown up, so.
Like generationally, would he be the same generation as Kat, or I guess so? Yeah.
I think they're fairly close in age. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I don't know.
I just think of her as being older because she's more crotchety.
I think she's. I don't know. I find her very perceptive in ways that are deeply tragic, because she can't affect any changes based on her perceptions, right? So she says at the beginning of the chapter, she's like, Greywind was back with Robb where he should be, and then she almost, because she is in a position not to be able to act directly, she lets those crystallizations of understanding kind of slip through her fingers. I feel like more often, I think that's part of what makes her so frustrating, is that she sees much more than she can act on, and thus significantly more than she retains. You know what I mean? Like she perceives it and then it's gone because she's not in a position to act on it immediately. And I don't know. I know there's kind of a fine tradition of cat hate in this fandom in particular, but
I'm not a cat hater. Just wanted to put that out there.
I think she's brilliant. I think she's so insightful and relatable as a mother. In spite of the shit in spite of the way she treated Jon, and she's human. I mean, it's understandable to a degree. And I think she's like a brilliant strategist, and she sees so much, as you say.
She is a brilliant strategist, but once she starts noticing anything that's not military, like to me it's very like patriarchal values make themselves very much known in the way people talk about Catelyn, because in her noticing women's hips and what they're likely to experience through childbirth and etc. like that. I mean, Jaime's always like, hey, I could take this guy in a fight, and they're not that different of an observation, it's like, but when we're so used to the machismo and talking about, the men's physical strength that like, and this is something that I think George does brilliantly, and I think that honestly the backlash to Catelyn is evidence of how brilliant it is. That Catelyn's point of view is she is able to dabble in that, quote unquote male area, but she is responsible for the female area and the children and all that, and the perpetuation of the Stark line. She has to do this. She literally has to. Like the Tullys, there are no other Tullys. Bryndon's gay. He's not getting married. If Robb doesn't have a child, the Starks are fucked. I mean, the Starks are already fucked. They don't know that yet, but like, it really bugs me when people are like, oh, how could she notice this? Like, well, because nobody else is thinking practically. And like, yeah, it's a little cold and a little detached. Sorry, two of her sons were just murdered, and one girl's probably dead, the other's married to a Lannister. Like, almost everything that people say against Catelyn, I'm like, yeah, but excuse me, like her experience and her, her place in this world, to me, more than justify the stuff that she, that we view as distasteful. It just bugs me. Well, like Catelyn's like, oh, this person has big hips, and people are like, oh, that bitch. Whereas, a male character is like, oh, I could fuck that woman. Oh yeah, he's such a badass. Like, no, come on.
And I think one of the things that makes me so fond of her, and also so heartbroken for her from so early on, I mean, much in advance of this particular tragedy, even when she's separated from Ned, like my in-laws joke that together they are a fully functioning person. So like, my father-in-law manages like certain aspects, and my mother-in-law is really good at other stuff, and he said like together, they add up to one kind of reasonable human being. And I think that was very much the case with Kat and Ned too. And I think that really for her and in many ways for him, the fracture that happened not just in their mutual displacement from their home and their family, but their separation from each other cost the other one parts that came from that partner, that were necessary to their survival, right? So I truly believe that that they would have functioned as a kind of complete whole, in a way that we almost never get to see them do, and we certainly don't see them do after he goes south, and literally and figuratively. And I don't know. I think that's part of what's so heartbreaking for me about her, is that she was in this perfect kind of socio-culturally predetermined, but also very effective family and political dynamic, where she excelled at her part and she was partnered with someone who excelled at his part, and together they were truly excellent. And that's stripped away from her almost as soon as we encounter her in the books. And yeah.
I mean, I guess the only thing I do sympathize with her is that she is constantly giving these warnings, and a lot of the people that like Robb is dealing with, the players in his story, she has known for many years and has more of a history with them. And then she is ignored a lot. But at the same time, I don't know, perhaps I'm being overly critical of her, but I fault her for not finding a way to make her voice heard, or giving up the ghost and going, well, you're not going to listen to me. I'm useless here. I'm going to go home and take care of her.
I kind of disagree a little bit with Hannah. I think it's admirable that Kat doesn't just accept the constraints that the societal role has put upon her, that she does use her intelligence to observe, to offer advice, to go and treat with Renly, to be another active person when her family's at war. And okay, she won't always be successful. Majority she won't be successful because society is misogynistic, but she does keep trying, she does keep pushing. And even in death, she comes back and she keeps pushing on it. So I find something quite admirable in that compared to a Cersei type character who takes those societal constraints and becomes very bitter and nasty and angry about them. Cat, sometimes you get her feeling weary or melancholy, but never nasty about the fact that she's not going to be as effective as she should be.
And also, I completely agree, Bina, and I also feel like, don't people criticize Catelyn for not leaving, for like not going and being with her children, back at home? Like, she goes to King's Landing. Oh, that's a bad thing. She shouldn't do that. And now, like, how could she leave Robb? How could she leave the only child that she, I mean, I think if Catelyn had heard about the Red Wedding, she would have thrown herself off of the nearest high point. I don't think that Catelyn, as the story, the version of Catelyn that is distilled through the horrors and trauma that she experiences, it was really meant to outlive Robb, because she invests so much in him, and that's why she invests so much in his sex life. So I feel like that's why. I don't know. I feel like people tend to want like everything of Catelyn at the same time.
Exactly, and in that sense, she's a very good cipher for what people want of women. They want them to be everything. Yeah. And I kind of feel, so what had happened? She'd have gone to Robb and said, look, there's something really dodgy happening here. We need to leave. I mean, either way, Robb's fucked. Once the Freys and Lannisters get together with the Boltons, if it's not the Red Wedding, he can't survive down, in the Midlands without their allies. So it's going to happen eventually, if not at the Red Wedding. I just feel that she's in a really invidious position. There are no good choices here.
Drink.
Speaking of $10 words, did anyone else have to look up the word susurrus? How do you even pronounce it?
It's like susurration. That's actually one I knew, although Sarah said things that I didn't know.
Yeah, I didn't know that one.
Is a good word because it means, I think, exactly what it sounds like, which is like, I don't know, like
meow or knock knock.
Yeah,
There's
well,
a word for that, right?
Yeah, like soothing, repetitive sound, right?
I didn't even register it.
You're that smart, Sarah. We know you don't have to rub it in.
No, I just have a very active, I don't know what that means, but the context is clear kind of filter, I think.
Yeah, me too. Sorry, Bina, just to answer what you said and not to start Catbait 2017. And it could be just me, but I find Catelyn to be very misogynist. And that's, I think, one of the things that drives me crazy about her the most. Like I said, she places value on women that she meets based on what they can give their husbands. She inwardly criticizes J.C. Mormont for the way she is. And then at the wedding, like, oh, she looks good in a dress. Like, it's just so...
But then that's an interesting question. Sorry, Amber, you go first.
To play the devil's advocate, though. Yeah, no worries. To play the devil's advocate, because of course, from our sensibilities, we want her to, be the uber woman. Can she really be blamed for misogyny that she's been, taught her entire life?
Do
you have to take it in context?
It's just I can't stand her for it. I don't identify with her at all as a character. I feel the same way about Sansa. I identify more closely with Cersei's attitude of defiance and rebellion in the face of stuff like that rather than a buy-in to it.
But then I think then let's draw an analogy between Jon. So on the one hand, if we're going to say that Jon is a victim of, or has taken on board all the messaging he's received about being a bastard and therefore becomes very self-scrutinizing and paranoid, it's exactly the same with Sansa and Cat. If you're raised in this world where every message you are given is that as an Aristo woman, your benefit, your entire purpose is to give your husband legitimate children. I mean, I think it's kind of almost superhuman to expect of these women to break out of that, just as it's superhuman to expect that Jon's going to be well adjusted and have a totally sort of healthy attitude towards people's attitudes towards him.
And, Cersei is an interesting example because she does break out, but would she have if she were a single child?
If she didn't have the comparison?
Yeah.
If she was going to inherit, you mean?
No, if she was born before or after Jaime, with a couple years between them, and her entire life wasn't like
not
you
an
get
only
to do this
child,
and Jaime gets to do this. Right, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I
And
mean,
that's not to like.
Cersei's probably a bad example because she's just crazy, right?
Well, she's crazy, but a lot of what drives Cersei crazy. I mean, this is why George. It's infuriating to read George because every time you're like 99.5% of the way toward deciding that a character is the worst human ever, he introduces some factor from their childhood or experience that you're like, okay, well, I guess I could see why you would come to that conclusion then if you really think about it.
I completely agree with that, Mikhail. What was really struck me when we did the Feast Dance character rereads, and I did the Cersei one, the Cersei Lannister one, where you just read all the chapters she has in Feast Dance, basically. And I was struck by how much what she does is so hateful and so nasty and so vindictive and cruel and borderline sort of, well, I don't think she is insane. I think she's just a very cruel person from birth. But so much of her reasoning is valid. So much of the pain she feels. I mean, she is a victim of great injustice, not just because she's born a woman in this society that is misogynistic, but because of her marriage, because of the way she's been treated, even by her father, then, trying to pawn her off in a second marriage. I mean, so I have, strange as it sounds, I have a great deal of sympathy with Cersei, and I have even more sympathy with Kat, because I think being dealt the same, well, not the same hand, because she at least had a good marriage, but an arranged marriage, and having to deal with this bastard, she doesn't deal with that well, but these are very circumscribed women, and I think we've got to be so careful about judging their choices in a modern context. I really do.
Yeah, I mean, I think to regard her as misogynist, especially in the kind of the perceptions that we see her registering in these internal monologues, I think is just out of time. I think it's just completely anachronistic. I mean, I think that it's very similar to what I was saying about Sansa, where the problem that we're having with her, the problem that we need to acknowledge we're having with her, is not that she is doing something exceptionally bad or exceptionally distasteful, but rather that she is conforming excellently to a series of sociocultural metrics that we find distasteful, right? So what she's doing is the best that she can do in a society that we find, from our modern perspective, to be repugnant for these various reasons.
Exactly. And I think that's the deep humanity that I love and adore in George R.R. Martin, is that he makes us feel sympathy for these people who are victims of a certain time and try to break out of it. And so you see that with Sansa, as we think she's on the cusp of progressing towards that. Jaime, a lot of these people have grown up in certain tropes, and they do as best as they can, and that's a deeply humane perspective, I feel.
I have this conversation with my students a lot, where we'll read, some ancient text or something, and they're like, "Oh, it's sexist. Like, these women are not, how can they feel this way, or it's so offensive, or whatever." And I mean, for me, like the perspective that I always encourage them to take on it is to gauge the metrics, or to sort of create the metrics and build them out of the evidence that the text gives, right? So as far as we see other women functioning, or the expectations and the pressures and the validations and the kind of demonizations of other women in this culture, like that is the way that I build my understanding of the way that things, quote unquote, ought to be or are supposed to be. And then it's interesting to look at the ways that individual characters contradict those or act against those expectations, but then also the way that other characters react to their countermanding of those ideas. So one of the things that I find so fascinating about Kat is that I don't think we ever really get anyone, even from an enemy perspective, describing her as stupid or irresponsible or shrewish or, a terrible mother, or any of these things that you would expect, or you could reasonably expect, if she were not admirable, or if the narrative didn't intend her to be admirable, that we would get from other perspectives. So, like, maybe a good example, because we don't ever see him functioning on his own, so like we can't really form an opinion of him, as Rhaegar, right? Where we have these kind of radically divergent pictures of Rhaegar, where on one hand he's a rapist and a Targaryen murderer and just the worst person ever, and then on the other hand he's maybe this romantic harp playing man of the people, like a warrior scholar and whatever. And people have those different opinions, but I don't think that we get that kind of divergence from the characters regarding Kat. And that's one of the things that I find so interesting about her, where like nobody really, unless I'm completely overlooking something, but I can't think of a point at which anybody says like, man, Robb Stark's mother is really, leading him around by the teat or whatever, like which it seems as though...
another way to interpret that is that George really admires her, and that he and whether or not he's successful, he intends for us to admire her.
Yeah, I just think that we don't have any evidence, any internal evidence from the text, either from sort of outcome or that what she's doing is meant to be discordant with the world that's being built here.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I also think it's very important for us as readers to, even if we find something distasteful, to make sure we know why that is. Like if a character is like, I mean, I'm revealing my biases here, but like horribly misogynist or whatever, like we can say like, well, we don't agree with that behavior anymore in our society. Where I think things get complicated is where you have stereotypically feminine characters. And this is very much my perspective. Like I've spoken with Katie about this, for example, and Katie has always identified with the Arya type. And she, so it was interesting because once we were discussing it and I was like, well, I always feel like everybody, judges Sansa for being like, the girly girl. And she's like, oh, I always feel like everybody judges Arya because you're not supposed to be like that in real life. Whereas my perspective was growing up and reading books where girls like Arya and women like girls like Arya were the protagonists, and women like Catelyn and Sansa were the the snotty girls that got left behind and didn't have the adventures. And I was like, well, that's me, so I guess I don't get to have adventures. And that's one of the reasons why I've like fallen so deeply in love with Sansa, because she is the closest I've come to a self-representation in fiction as far as somebody who experiences those kind of fears. But I feel like sometimes as a society, we do sort of reject, at least from my perspective again, reject things that we don't want to value, like being a girly girl, or like Sansa's good at sewing, like, ugh, I don't like that. She's a girly girl. Like we're cued to a certain degree to expect certain behavior of a Sansa character and to dislike that, and to expect certain behavior of an Arya character to dislike that. And it's been really interesting to watch as the books have progressed, and both of these characters have gone down. Sorry, I know that we were talking about Catelyn, but apparently I just made this about Arya and Sansa.
No, that's good. This is a discussion. It's great.
Yeah, Catelyn plays into this too, that like the reasons why we have negative associations with that is maybe because our society tells us it's wrong and we're just being judgmental, like, and it's not necessarily wrong, so I again, everybody's 100% like, these are fiction, like your emotional response is equally as valid as your intellectual response or whatever. I just think, once we all get into this level of we're interrogating it and thinking about our responses to it, I think it's interesting to see like, oh, I'm having a reaction according to the values of my culture. That can be a great thing, or maybe that's not a good thing.
I don't know even if I would put it in terms of like good or bad, but it's certainly, I think, an over accentuation of one or the other can lose nuance from a work that's as sophisticated as this is. Because I do think that George is almost always playing that double game, right? Where he's saying like, these people think this is okay. How does that make you feel? Like that there's
I completely agree.
A tease to it where it says like, I don't know. Yeah. So I mean, I think to read it at both of those levels, and I think that's why these reread endeavors are so incredibly valuable, because you do, if you respond viscerally the first time, then maybe you're more likely to see something from a different perspective the second time, or vice versa, right? If you're reading it for like clues and mysteries and kind of Easter eggs, then you're switched off to that, that visceral reaction. But it's something you can go back and experience again.
Does anyone have anything specific on this chapter they want to get out there?
I thought one of the other ways, sort of in connection to the point that I was making before about that false sense of security, and how this chapter almost gives us a relief from the kind of panic that was building up with the Old Stones chapter, that the way they regard and subsequently describe the phrase as a brood is so dismissive and so condescending that you really do lose sight of the fact that they could be so threatening. And obviously Kat is saying, you need gastrite and you need, but he's a fleshy pink buzzard and a weasel, and the Wayman,
look at him like trailer trash, huh?
Yeah, like he's described, Ryman has described his face is fleshy, broad, and stupid, and that's like the first introduction that we have in this chapter, and the sort of first forward that we have back into the twins. And I think there is something very discordant about the idea that this class of people, essentially, that they're so condescending towards them, but then they end up being so incredibly threatening, in a way that none of the description, like, that guy has zits, but like there's no sense of like wily animals. Like the description of him as a grotesque child, I think, was one of the most poignant ones for me. Like,
which is profoundly ironic because, sorry, Hannah, go ahead.
Oh, no, it's okay. I was just going to say it's funny that they view them that way because they're so dependent on the thing that they have. But they're kind of like, society, like, oh, new money, like the lower of the upper class in a sense kind of thing. But then they need them very much for this one commodity they have.
Yeah. And I mean, I wouldn't ever go so far as to empathize with Walder Frey, I don't think. But if this is a kind of a consistent Westerosi opinion, I mean, like, he kind of throws away when he's talking about Jingle Bell, he's like, he has less wits than a Crannogman. And I'm like, first of all, it's fewer wits. But second of all, but there are these stereotypes that function, and I think the Freys have very much been, in a sense, culturally victimized by the stereotypes that have built around them, in a way that I think could lead to these kind of epic resentments that manifest as the Red Wedding. Again, not justifiably necessarily, but certainly perceptibly, like, understandably.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was going to say that that's exactly why all of this happens. I mean, there are a million reasons, but if you're talking about Walder Frey's, prime motivation, it's that insecurity and that promise of legitimacy and the ultimate diss of like, never mind, we're gonna marry somebody else.
To the extent that I feel like if Robb had been betrothed to somebody from pretty much any other family except maybe the Lannisters and done the same shit, that like maybe the fallout wouldn't have been quite so serious. But it was the combination of them sort of multi-generationally underestimating this entire family in conjunction with the resentment that's built up in that family for that underestimation or that devaluing. It's just
at
kind of the
same
perfect storm.
time, though, what a fucking steep price to pay for crossing a river. Like, you know what I mean? Like, how dare you even ask for something like that, you a-hole? I mean, if it were me, I would have been like, yeah, you can cross, just remember I let you cross when you win the war, and don't tell anyone I let you cross. Like,
that's the paradox of the phrase,
right?
That's the paradox that they exist in. They are actually strategically important in the right time and place, desperately so. But the great houses of Westeros continue to be like, So, when it comes time, and obviously Walder Frey should get over himself. And, if you want to be a little bit, if you want the other houses to regard you better, maybe send some kids to King's Landing.
Maybe learn your granddaughters' names.
Exactly. There's a lot of options beyond just, pure vindictiveness. However, it again, with that George's maddening consistency in these characters, that you can see the line from A to B to Red Wedding. Catelyn and Robb should never have been in the position to have to crawl to Walder Frey on their knees to be allowed to cross a river, but the whole situation led up to that on both sides, and
I feel like we do have a hashtag not all phrase moment here, though, because she goes Kat goes looking for Sir Perwyn, I think, who she says went with her to Renly's to see Renly, and that they said he's been sent away. And so I found myself
home.
I found myself questioning like whether that was at least a partial response to the question that was raised in VOC 400, where did they tell all of them? Did some of them dissent? How is it that there was such a united front on? And so I wonder if he is an example of, or his absence is an example of how they dealt with people who were not okay with this kind of wholesale slaughter, and they just sent them away, and they said, just keep your mouth shut, and that was loyalty to the family, but that they also didn't take part in it. And I also thought it was interesting that the maester identifies him as Rosalind's brother, and so I wondered if Rosalind knew, and that's why she was crying. But
Rosalind knew.
Did she?
She absolutely knew.
Yeah, 100%.
And
I think all of them that are still there know.
So why does, like, I thought Edmure's line of questioning was actually pretty reasonable. Like, why does Walder bother to give him such a nice wife?
I mean, again, I think it's quelling any alarm bells,
Okay.
It's, look how reasonable we're being. We're going to throw you guys a nice wedding. Chill out, it's fine, I mean, ironically, maybe the phrase would have been better off being like, ugh, here's the ugly one,
Yeah.
You have the worst room. But it worked anyway.
In Rob's face, like, we could have had this.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Well, which is actually, I mean, it's not to like go into the show in detail or anything, but like it's markedly more hostile in the show, as I recall.
How do you think it would have been different if Arya had either gotten there before the actual Red Wedding, like the day of, or if somehow had been able to get word to them that she was so close to them? Do you think much would have gone down differently, or she would have just been killed as well?
She'd just be dead. Yeah, she'd just be dead. Yeah, basic.
You don't think Catelyn would have taken her away?
No. They probably would have married her off to her betrothed Frey as a double wedding or something silly. But yeah, they would have just, it would have just re-emphasized the Starks coming together with the Freys, and then she would be dead.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
I mean, actually, I guess if they had done a like, hey, you're here too, let's marry you off, like that might have saved her life, as such as it,
In the Jaime chapter, Bolton says that, in the chapter at Harrenhal, Bolton says that engagement has already been called off.
Oh, right, it was. Yeah.
Which I thought was really weird, and I don't know if it was just because she was missing,
no,
or whether
that's why the kid in Harrenhal is crying, and he's like, I'm not gonna get to marry my princess anymore, and Arya's like, oh, I'm sorry, and he's like, or whatever, and she's like, I hope your princess dies, and the princess is Arya.
Yeah. But I thought that was
just
another
thinking more
weird,
of like if she were nearby and got word somehow to them, that she were nearby, and perhaps Cat leaves to go get her.
I mean,
do they proceed with their plan, or do they like wait for her to get back? Do they send someone to hunt them down?
Yeah, I feel like best case scenario they would have been ridden down the next day. Like I don't see.
I mean, to be fair,
best case scenario is she gets married off to some other Frey and is hostage like Edmure, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
I don't think they'd leave a Stark alive, though. I think they only leave Admirable alive because he's not a Stark, so he can't ever be claimed as like heir to the Northern throne.
And actually, the Lannisters wouldn't let them keep her alive because they've got Sansa Stark as the heiress to the north. Mm-hmm. And so why would you leave the Freys with a slightly less good but still very good claimant? So yeah, I think Arya's just dead, basically.
Yeah. Well, and also Roose already has fake Arya, so
that
real Arya might actually be an inconvenience at that point.
Yeah. I will say in to the service of narrative, I mean the phrase plan is execute. Like this whole thing falls into place like your dream game of Tetris, Like, there are just no gaps. Maybe Rosalind crying is the only gap in the plan. But other than that, it really, I mean, that's for next time. But it's worth noting that George doesn't there aren't any close calls here for the Starks, really. Not until things get going.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think that about wraps it up for the pre-Red Wedding episode of the Song of Ice and Fire linear reread. We've got everyone to the twins, so carnage will occur next episode. If you want to follow along at home, the next episode, episode 50, is going to be Arya 10, Cat 7, Arya 11, A Storm of Swords. So it's the 3 Red Wedding chapters. The hosts are going to be some of the VOC curators that perhaps couldn't participate in the VOC 400 discussion, which was, of course, a full cast recording of that chapter. So we're going to have Mikhail back. Yay! We're going to get Katie, who hasn't been on a reread, I don't think, ever. Nadia, Adam, and Glenn. And Glenn, I think, has been on very few, if any.
Oh my goodness, Glenn! Wow.
I know. So we're getting some curators who you won't normally have heard from, which will be pretty nice. And in the meantime, if you want to keep up with us, you can search for Vassals of Kingsgrave. We've got Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, WordPress. If you want to get involved, however, check out the forums of a podcast of Ice and Fire. See if there are any topics in there that you want to participate in or kick off. So with that, thank you very much to my fellow podcasters, to Mikhail, Sarah, Hannah, this has been, and Amber Rocks. How could I forget?
Amber Rock.
Amber, who I feel sort of went back into lurking mode, but has been an absolute pleasure to have on.
Well, I got a lot done while we were podcasting.
So yeah, thank you ladies all for participating. I can't wait for our next La La Land meet.